The South Sea island of Hikueru is remote and lonely, a little more than a speck of sand, lost in the immensity of the ocean. Still, it was said that people had lived here forever, that life was full and good. The sea and the land filled almost all the needs of the people of Hikueru. But there were some necessities of life that didn't grow on trees. And one of these was courage. Courage was important. And so many legends were recounted to explain it. One of these told of a boy named Mafatu and his dog Tambu. He was known as the boy who was afraid, and his greatest fear was the sea beyond the barrier reef. On this day, the legend went, a fisherman brought the news that the bonito was schooling. For the villagers, the news meant rejoicing. To Mafatu, it meant panic and shame.
Yorana Mafatu. Yorana.
His uncle Tihoni was patient and understanding, and somehow that only made him feel worse. Mafatu's father had been chief, and now it was time the boy learned to lead the fishing canoes, for he too would be chief one day. But Mafatu could think only of the terror that lay in wait for him beyond the reef. That night, he dreamed again, the same dream that had haunted him since he was 6 years old. It began, as always, far out on a calm sea, himself a happy boy afraid of nothing, and his father, Chief Tavananui, diving for mother of pearl. He could never outrun the horror of his father's death. By morning, Mafatu had finally got to sleep again, far off on an empty beach. But the call of the Triton shell brought back the panic again. Only when the fishermen had headed out to sea did Mafatu's fear subside into shame. The fishermen had brought back a great haul of bonito, and that evening the whole island celebrated with tamara'a. Mafatu was excluded from the merrymaking by his own feeling of disgrace. How could a coward ever be chief? Out there was the sea, Mafatu's enemy. But was life here on the island in the midst of contempt any better? And so, says the legend, while the people of Hikueru sang a song of returning home, the boy who was afraid paddled a borrowed canoe out toward the pass in the reef, fully aware that he might never come back. With the dawn came trouble. The storm raged all that day and through the following night, driving the helpless canoe before it. In the morning, Mafatu was almost surprised to find that he and Tambu were still alive. But where were they? There was no sail, no supplies, only the paddle. But when the horizon is empty, which way do you paddle? By late morning, Mafatu had just about given up hope. But that was when he saw the coconuts floating by. They could mean land was near. Mafatu had spent all his life on a low coral atoll. High islands like this existed only in legend. But there it was, and he was about to land on it. The entire island was protected by a jagged barrier reef, and if there was a pass, Mafatu couldn't find it. Mafatu had met the sea on its own terms, and so far he had lived, and so had Tambu. The long days at sea had left him far too tired to enjoy the victory. He hardly even had the strength to wonder what strange shore he had been cast upon. All his life, Mafatu had heard legends of high islands like this, and always as the home of evil spirits. But here he was, and he'd have to make the best of it. Instead of evil spirits, he found himself in paradise, a place where things to eat grew everywhere he looked, and fresh water ran unendingly from the cliffs. The more he explored, the more it looked as if he and Tambu were the island's only inhabitants. But what he saw then wasn't so reassuring. Who or what had made that trail through the grass? The boar had proved there was danger on the island, but a boar could be avoided. He wouldn't follow any more animal trails, but the trail ahead of him now was different. So all he'd heard about the high islands must be true. Whoever had left these skulls couldn't have been gone for long, because here was a freshly planted taro patch. They would surely be back for the harvest. Now Mafatu knew whose island this was. He'd heard many tales of the Mauka, a people who took human lives for ritual purposes and feasted on human flesh. This was their marae, their sacred place. Frightened as he was, Mafatu saw something in the idol's hands he knew he needed badly, a basalt spearhead. Back on his own side of the island, Mafatu began to set up camp. From the fiber of the coconut husk, he would make twine. With the spearhead, he could cut kindling. And with the twine strung on a bow, he was able to start a fire. For his first hot meal, he would have roast breadfruit. The shallow pools at the edge of the lagoon made convenient fish traps. At home in Hikueru, all these chores had been considered woman's work. But Mafatu, the boy who was afraid, had learned them while other boys were out learning to fish and dive with the men. Now he found them very useful. Thatched palm fronds made a comfortable shelter, and the woven ones made a sleeping mat. His camp was turning into a home. Before long, life had settled into a routine. Most mornings, his breakfast came from a coconut palm. On this particular morning, his view of the beach showed him something he had to investigate right away. It was part of his canoe. Up till now, he hadn't realized how lucky he had been to come across the reef unhurt. It was obviously beyond repair, but nearby was something that might eventually prove useful: his steering paddle. It was a young otaha bird. There was no telling how he got here, but he was obviously too young to be on his own. Somehow, that struck a note of sympathy with Mafatu, another orphan washed up on the same strange beach. Mafatu decided to name his new friend Kiwi.
Tomo, Kiwi. Kiwi, Tomo.
Soon Kiwi had relaxed and made himself at home, and Mafatu got back to his chores. He spent a lot of time beachcombing these days, and the skeleton of a turtle was a very useful find. The shell would make good knife blades, but even more valuable was the breastbone, which, when polished, would make a perfect pair of lenses for diving goggles. The next thing he made was a cowrie shell octopus lure. Now that he could see to hunt in the deeper waters of the lagoon where the octopus lived, it would be practical now, too, to trap some lobster. After placing his lobster trap, he went looking for octopus. An octopus home could usually be recognized easily by the litter of discarded shells outside the entrance. Octopus was a favorite food of the Polynesians, and a curry was a favorite food of the octopus. Every so often, Mafatu found himself drawn back across the island to the place of the skulls and the taro patch. The taro was growing rapidly now, and he could never find anything to convince him that he'd been wrong. Tamauka would be back. In the days that followed, Mafatu came to be familiar with almost every feature of the island, but it seemed there were new discoveries all the time, and a steep hill covered with palm fronds was an invitation for some fun. It was fun, all right, but there was much work to be done, too. In fact, the most important piece of work he had tried to do yet. This involved burning through the base of a good-sized tamanu tree from which he would make a canoe. Once it was on the ground, the trunk was carefully hollowed out, again by fire. To rig the canoe, Mafatu would need plenty of rope, and once again he found himself doing woman's work. As he worked, he often thought of home. It was the song of homecoming to Hikueru. But for some reason, he couldn't remember the end of it. Oh well, there were too many other things to think about anyway. The canoe floated like a dream. In the way of his people, he splashed it with seawater and dedicated to Kiwi. The legend says that Mafatu was very pleased with his canoe. No one could say that making it had not been a man's work. The lobster trap had clearly been broken into, and Mafatu had a good idea where the culprit would be. It didn't take long to find him, a moray eel. He knew the eel was dangerous, but he would also be good eating. And in any case, he had to stop him from raiding the trap. Mafatu continued to explore the island, and on this particular day, Tambu ran off to do some exploring of his own. Roast pig was a welcome change of diet, but Mafatu had just one regret about the feast, that he only had Tambu and Kiwi to share it with. His people back in Hikueru would have been very surprised to see the boy who was afraid with a necklace of boar's tusks. As it was, though, only Mafatu knew about it. But that was enough. Before long, life returned to normal. Mafatu kept busy weaving a pandanus leaf sail for the canoe. Tambu lived happily on leftover bones, and Kiwi spent the days trying to teach himself how to fly. Mafatu was coming up from checking his lobster trap some days later when Tambu called his attention to the intruder. Usually, the barrier reef kept sharks out of the lagoon, but this one had somehow found his way in. It was the old nightmare again, but this time it was real. The legend says it took some time for Mafatu to realize what he'd done. He had actually met the terror of his dreams in combat, and he had won. It was only a few days later that he was ready to try out the new sail. Kiwi, flying meant more than just freedom. It meant a return to his own kind. And for the first time in many weeks, Mafatu felt terribly alone. The high island that had saved his life was really his prison. And now the Mauka's taro was ripe and ready for the harvest. From the crest of the ridge, Mafatu could see a fire at the place of the skulls. The Mauka had come back.
Tambu!
Vite la Temarii! La Temarii, Fafaf!
Once again, Mafatu was alone at sea with no food, no water, and no idea where he was going. But the legend tells us of a curious fact. The boy who was afraid was no longer afraid, only determined. He still couldn't remember the last line, but Hikueru's song of returning home kept running through his head, almost against his will. Then suddenly, the stars gave him the words, "I will land under 3 in a row." Hikueru lay under those 3 stars. The legend leaves out the many hardships of the journey and tells us only how it ended. At first, the villagers thought they were welcoming a stranger, and even when Mafatu stepped ashore, many thought so still. But then he was recognized, and his long journey was over at last. So he had survived, and from the necklace it was obvious to everyone it had taken real courage. And so, the legend says, there was a great tamara'a for Mafatu, who would soon be chief. The frightened boy who had left Hikueru had come home a man.